You could do tempo runs. You can do, for some guys, walking on a treadmill, gymnastics. That's why I like the long extended warm-ups with our kids, because it's going to give them that aerobic stimulus because they're constantly moving. And it's play that you and I would have gotten as youngsters that we get now, maybe probably 4 to 5 hours a week of that type of work through non-program work. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get it. And then you have to test the athlete to see if it's improving.
That was Mark McLaughlin, and welcome to another episode of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. It's great to have you here. As I mentioned, our guest is Mark McLaughlin. He is a physical preparation coach with a diverse background who has trained hundreds of athletes from Olympic to grade school to special forces. He's worked with professional organizations such as the NFL, Major League Baseball, NCAA, and others. And he's currently the strength coach for the Lake Oswego School District in Oregon. On this episode, Mark will be speaking on his physical preparation process, covering many ends of the spectrum. On one end, we'll be looking at his developmental process, so how he structures athleticism, such as gymnastics and rhythm-based work, within his warm-ups. And on the other end, we'll be getting into the process of sports mastery through constraints, and then leading into a little bit more of a technical side, or the technical side of things, speaking on heart rate and aerobic training, talking about some of the key markers that he uses for tracking the aerobic system, as well as the importance of aerobic development to recover from sport movement, explosive training. And if you've heard other coaches who have spoken about Mark and the athletes he's worked with, Mark gets results. And you can tell just how deep Mark's knowledge goes through listening to this podcast. It was really fun talking to him on almost, you could call it the full spectrum of development, from more of that pedagogical, motor learning, developmental side into a little bit more of the technical key performance indicator and that structural element of things. And before we get to the episode, I just wanted to highlight our sponsor, Lost Empire Herbs. If you want a free bag of one of their flagship products, Pine Pollen, you can go to justflypinepollen.com and you can get your free product there with only the modest and normal cost of shipping. I absolutely love Lost Empire. They have been a staple in my supplementation regime for years now, and it's an awesome alternative to the typical, you could just call it more processed, more manufactured type supplement. I've gotten great effects on the level of energy, strength, and overall well-being from using the Lost Empire Herbs products. Some of my favorites other than Pine Pollen are things like Shilajit or their Phoenix formula. And again, if you're interested in trying out performance herbalism, you can get that free bag of Pine Pollen at justflypinepollen.com. All right, let's get on to the episode with Mark McLaughlin. Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here today. I'd like to get started by just sharing a little bit about the diversity of the groups that you work with. I think, a lot of people work with, depending on your setting, right? One or two or maybe many sports, but it sounds like you have quite the diversity amongst groups that you train and work with.
Yeah. So at the high school in the district I work in, I have football at one school. I have boys and girls basketball, boys and girls lacrosse. I have dance team. I have cheerleading. I have alpine skiing, baseball, softball. And then I also work with 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So each day I'm challenged with a lot of different sports and a lot of different, levels of athletes that I need to adjust to give everybody the best experience that we can possibly give them.
Yeah, when I think about like sports performance, strength and conditioning, whatever the term, whatever the term is, I do think about that. We think about GPP or general, and we were even chatting about this a little bit before we push record. Is in some ways, if you only work with one population, I think sometimes you can almost dig so far, like you dig really far into little small nuances, but at the same time, sometimes it's so much easier when you just start working with another sport, another population, and it gives you a new insight, a new window to really how the whole system works, or even, youth up to pro or anything like that. And so I'd be curious, particularly what you've been learning too from working from some of the sports that most of us don't work with, like alpine skiing or dance or something like that. Or you said cheerleading as well. I'm curious what you've learned from working with some of those sports that are a little bit different in terms of your perspective on the total process.
Yeah, so like alpine skiing, so I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I saw this video about the attacking Vikings, which is the Norwegian national team. That's kind of their nickname for the group. And then, they had a whole video on their testing, and they call it the Ironman testing, where they have, I think, 7 or 8 events over the day. And I'm like, man, the video is so cool. And, I can't even stand up on skis, but I watched that video and I'm like, oh my God, man, I wish, I could do that or be part of that. And so when I got the opportunity to work with the ski team at the 2 schools I work with, like I just dove head into like, okay, how did those guys train? How did they come up, with the testing? What was the science behind it? And so I started integrating those tests for the junior skiers with the group that I was working with. So, I had some special testing devices built that the Norwegian group used. And so as a coach, it just gave me a new insight into what that sport demanded, because it's totally different than any other sport that you would train. And then just started building these programs to help those skiers become physically fit for their sport. And so then I posted some videos on Instagram, and this guy by the name of Tyler Walker said, hey, man, I used to coach strength and conditioning in Colorado. I worked with downhill skiers, and he's a good skier himself. So then I started sending him videos of the skiers I was working with skiing. And so him and I developed this relationship where he's like my ski mentor for the physical training. So then I started learning all of these other nuances with this sport that I never would have learned about. And, dance is the same thing. Like their events last 2 minutes, but they're hitting heart rates of 200. I mean, I've had heart rate monitors on them where they're hitting 200 beats per minute. And then putting those on the girls and then having them do the routine. And from a subjective point of view, you're looking at them thinking, okay, they're not going hard, but then talk to them after that 2 minutes is up and they're like, oh yeah, man, we get so psyched up, so it's this psychological driver of the heart rates. Okay, well, then we need to train them differently to maybe not have such a large stress response, or if, when that stress response happens, to be able to perform under those circumstances. So those are some of the few highlights of it's like, and then as a coach and on a selfish level, I just learned so much more, and the art of it and all my passion even comes even further.
Yeah, it's interesting with the dance. Like, so basically you're saying that for the actual physical work they're doing, their heart rates maybe shouldn't be quite that high. It's just because like the music and the intensity and the environment, the psychological piece of it too is really spiking that sympathetic response, even beyond what it typically should be, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yes. So I did a lot of subjective questioning after that, because I needed to understand more, like, what is that sport like? What does it entail? And the school that I'm at, like, they're the best in the state and one of the best teams in the country. So the stress to perform each event, so to speak, at such a high level was driving their fear of failure and the fear, hey, this thing is going to be super hard. So kind of putting them into these situations more often to allow them to get used to it. And then, training the aerobic system, because then I read some papers on dance. So kind of understanding, okay, what kind of base fitness do they need to have in order to withstand these high pressure situations?
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about, one, I liked using, if the group I'm working with is into it, using like music and rhythm in conjunction with basic exercises. Like Paul Cater, who's mentored me in a lot of that stuff, he'll use like the typical speed ladder, but he'll have people do the patterns to music just to kind of attune attention and really drive that. He calls it that tuning as well, where you're kind of tuning the body, the muscle, the tendon up, if you will. But I find that athletes, when you do that kind of warm up, if I test like a counter movement or an RSI after like a rhythm type warm up compared to if we did it without, they jump a lot higher if we do the rhythm aspect before. And I think about it, just maybe there's that just general sympathetic response too to having music, to turning things into more of a dance in general, like based off what you're saying. I was just curious, I'd imagine the heart rates are higher. It's like motivating. It kind of probably reduces the perception of how hard you're working too, perhaps.
Yeah. And if you look at like the athletic skills model group, they're the ones that developed, the IAX training system, like in the, late 90s. They use rhythm and dance as a big part of their development program. And I actually use our dance team to teach our football players how to dance.
Nice.
Because it gets them out of their comfort zone. It's something that they normally don't do. And to your point, it's a rhythm thing. And sport and movement is rhythm. And we get a lot of these guys that, oh, yeah, man, they run a 4.3 or they bench, 900 pounds or whatever. But the fluidity of movement, the athleticism, I guess, if you want to call it, isn't there. And so how do we continue to push the boundaries for these athletes to give them that rhythm? So training with music is a big thing. Gymnastics is a big thing. Dance. There's simple dance and foot movements that we do as part of the warm up with all the kids. And then it's going to force them to think and to, learn a new skill. And so I think the more skills and diversity I can give them, they will perform better, but then is the chance of injury going down because they're moving through a bunch of different movement skills.
Yeah, I love that. I would love to see a video of the dance team teaching the football team some basics of rhythm.
Yeah.
It reminds me too,
yeah.
Oh yeah, if you have it, I'll put it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. And I think, anybody who trains young kids should, research the athletic skills model. I watch a bunch of videos from like early 1930s and 40s, like East Germany, and, how they're kind of teaching their athletes the gymnastic movements and all that kind of stuff. And so, what we're doing is not new. It's, it's hundreds of years old, but these kids aren't exposed to it. And then the podcast you had with Randy Huntington, I believe Randy spoke about kids not having, a lot of PE classes nowadays. So I think, okay, should my training at some point be a big PE gymnastics class?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say. Sorry, I jumped in there, but I was just gonna say that it is so interesting too to look at. Well, one, like working in track and field, like working in club track, the kids who had gymnastics backgrounds were always the fastest to learn different skills, and they just had really good overall athleticism. But even with the rhythm piece, Paul Cater had said, and I can totally see this, is that the athletes who were the worst at the rhythm, like, all right, we're going to do music and you're going to go through the ladder on this particular rhythm or whatever it was that he was having them do, is the athletes who were the worst at that, who didn't have a rhythm, I guess, or whatever term you want to put in there, they were the ones actually more likely to get injured. Like he could see at least visibly a trend where if someone didn't have a basic rhythmic ability, that it's going to put them at a potentially higher risk of injury. And I do think about, well, like even injuries, it's just little missed timings. It's not like, I don't think it's so much of a global maybe issue on the micro level as it is a muscle just didn't fire when it was supposed to. It's a timing issue. And obviously there's some readiness associated with that as well, but at its core. And I think about that as well. I'm curious if you have any take on that with rhythm and injury. I don't think there's been any research or anything like that, but and then I was going to say too about there's been several, at least on the women's side, track and field athletes who have reached a high level who have a dance background. I know Valerie Allman, the discus thrower, is one, and I think there's been a couple others. It's really cool to see the way that they move through that. I've had a couple of podcasts talking about Irish dance as well. Sorry, I'm just kind of shooting a lot. I was going to ask you about if you have any thoughts though on fluidity and rhythm and potential injury risks as you see it.
Yeah, so I watch a lot of practice of the sport practice itself. And, coaches are saying, my kids can't get into this position. They don't, look good here. and you hear coaches say, get your hips down, get your hips down, all of these cues that they give. And so then I work it back to my training, like how can I, and I'm not even saying that those cues are right, but how can I give these athletes a skill set to be able to get into their position for their sport to have an advantage against their opponent? And if they have that advantage, will that keep them out of injury risk? And you're right. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into injury. But if they know how to move, if they know how to kind of manage space against their opponent, and they know of different ways to get out of situations, whether it be somersaults, tumbling, just the way they move their feet through dance and different things like this, when that time comes that they're in a prone position, will it give them a better opportunity to get out of that and to gain, another advantage? So I just think that doing all this stuff is going to allow them to mitigate the risks that they face in practice and games. And then people always, especially now, the kids are lazy. They are at home on their screens all day. They don't have PE, whatever. And so if they don't have that, then as coaches, at least in my mind, that we better give them every opportunity to stretch their boundary of their preparedness.
Yeah, 100%. It is. One thing I was going to say with that was the spatial recognition being also a really important. Yeah, and of course the rhythm isn't. Just because you have rhythm doesn't mean you're going to be injury proof. There's so many other things that go into it. But you were talking about the space. Like I remember, I believe it was Jeff Moyer when he was on here talking about a while ago, talking about how a lot of injury happens because athletes they didn't make the right decision on the field and they got like caught in a bad position or something like that. It's like spatial awareness, and you got just caught in a bad position because you just didn't get ready in time. And I think about different skills or things or practices you could expose athletes to, and it makes me think about capoeira, which barely any athletes probably do, but like capoeira is so interesting. It's like basically dance fighting. It's almost all that. It's rhythm and space and like I think there's a lot of rolling and tumbling or things like that. Sometimes I feel like I've tried such a wide variety of things in the training practice, but I mean, just learning how to fall too. I see people do training where they intentionally fall, roll, tumble. I mean, gymnastics is basically that. So, yeah.
Kind of my thing is, durability equals availability. And so I look at, I watch so many YouTube videos, but Andreas Thorkelson, I believe, he was a javelin thrower in Norway. And his coach has a podcast with, I can't remember the guy's name, but, he wanted to develop like a super athlete was Andreas. And so they used gymnastics to, form to really make him robust so that he wasn't injured. And for that sport with how, and better than I do, I mean, the javelin is it's a hard sport on your body. So they use gymnastics to build him up. And you watch some of those training videos, and I use a lot of the ideas, walking on his hands. I mean, I purchased a set of parallel bars, gymnastics parallel bars. So we have all our athletes now working on that for, upper body,
that's awesome.
ability and, strength and movement, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, man, if this guy who was world champion, Olympic champion, goes back to a basic gymnastics routine to build his durability, why shouldn't I be doing that as a coach with my athletes? I mean, not some stupid, just bench or sprint till they die, but actually give them this durability that's going to allow them to play their sport, hopefully, injury free. So I think there's a lot that can be taken from these great coaches and athletes that just is basic.
Yeah, those parallel bars would be such a cool addition in the gym. Even just things like even hand walking, along the length of it, I'm sure, or just like some or basic swings, things like that. I tried to do this is probably as far as I went with attempting to do some of that, but we had Kaiser jumpers at Cal, and if you could actually do like a tall dip, I think we didn't have, or we had at one point maybe had some glute hams that doubled as like some sort of dip type apparatus, but I ended up doing like small scale, either tall dips or body swings between the Kaiser jumpers. So it's it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Like the Kaiser jumper is great for jumping, great tool for jumping and explosion there. But then you got two side by side. You could jump up and do like kind of gymnastic type stuff on top of that. Probably not even close to their intended use. But between those, the actually using them as intended and then doing gymnastics on top of them, I think we got a pretty good double out of that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, man. And the athletes love it. I mean, Landon Evans, who's a really good friend of mine, when he was at Iowa, he told me, he's like, when the athletes come off the track or out of the gym and they're smiling, it's like, he's like, I know I've done my job. And man, that little comment that he told me, like, has really stuck with me.
Yeah.
And so when I'm watching the athletes come out of our gymnastics hall or out of the weight room or off the track or whatever, and again, it doesn't always happen. They're not always smiling all the time. But I mean, that should be our goal with these young athletes. And because it's going to keep them coming back tomorrow, the next day, the next day. And so, like, all this gymnastics stuff, they just absolutely eat it up.
Yeah, we had the smiling thing ever since Rafe Kelly mentioned it probably 4 or 5 years ago on this podcast series. Like, that has always been in my brain for the warm-ups. And be it games or we had at Calix, we didn't have the dips. The Kaisers were the unofficial dip type stand where you could do small swinging motions, but the monkey, we had these monkey bars, like it was like a Sorinex huge rack system and monkey bars that went all the way through it. And we always did that stuff for warm-ups, and people always, you always saw smiles on people's faces for that kind of thing. It was just a lot of fun. And I would sometimes too, like, throw like pull-ups in, like do 3-4 monkey bars, then do a pull-up, do 3 monkey bars, do 2 pull-ups, and that kind of thing. And people would have, obviously a lot of athletes, like especially the swimmers, they enjoy pull-ups anyways, but it was so much fun to watch them do like a few monkey bars. You kind of get to rest, then do a few more, and that kind of thing really added to the dynamic of pre-existing exercises as well. And it was just a whole lot of fun.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you as well, Mark, you mentioned, and I had this later, maybe later in the show, but I did want to bring it up just because I thought it was such a good post. And you mentioned this kids aren't, and I don't feel like it's like old curmudgeon saying this, but kids aren't the same. Like, it is not the same these days as it used to be. I remember when I was living in Berkeley before I moved out to Ohio, and like literally there was never kids out playing. Like, I never saw kids out playing. And that was actually part of the reason I moved to the neighborhood I did when I was looking for houses over here, is I saw a neighborhood and there was tons of kids out playing. I was like, oh, this is great. I definitely want my kids to grow up in an environment that's more like this. You had reposted, it was like these kids in Brazil playing soccer in the street, and not even like a clean, nice, like it was like a kind of a T-junction of a street, and they're like barefoot. And I'm like, and it was Rob Gray, I think, was talking about that constraints-led approach type learning. And sometimes I think to myself, I'm like, how much can we make up for this? If kids aren't just getting out and just doing this. I know we can. Obviously we can do what we can, and we try to do the best we can. One, I'm just curious of your thoughts on that video, like that part of development, if there's anything, even in talking with like parents or anything. I'm just curious how we can almost get to more of that. I'd take a lot, but any of your thoughts on that type of development?
So that post, and I think with training with a lot of different sports and a lot of different age groups, like those posts really resonate with me because I am dealing with young kids, like kids. And I remember growing up, I had, there was 4 boys in my family, and we were always playing outside. And so then kids are sitting in school all day, AP testing, ACT, everything is very geared towards, high levels at some of these schools with these students. And then they don't get a lot of playtime. And then COVID was another thing, lockdown, and, how did kids go through that? And that's something that as children, you and I didn't have to deal with. And so I look at that post and I think, oh my God, that was me with my brothers, not soccer, but some game.
Yeah, it's whatever.
That was me. Yeah. And that was me and my friends. And, then I posted another one about Rolandinho, and, he grew up playing in bare feet, and his dad said, hey, it's to improve your touch, but they just didn't have the money to buy shoes for him. And so, And so I watch those videos and I think, how can we do that at the school I'm at? Because I have 100% control over the environment. Okay, so I have spike ball, I have team handball, we have gymnastics that's outside, I have a balance beam, we have a gymnastics hall. So basically, the first 15 to 30 minutes of each day is free play.
That's awesome.
They choose. I don't coach it. I give them constraints of tracks over here.
That's the constraint. Nice.
Be careful crossing the track. Go out and be kids. Be yourself. And then, after 20 to 30 minutes, they start coming in, and then we, kind of start the formal session. And I think trying to put less constraints on them, being less coached. I mean, I bet through a training session, sometimes I don't speak for total maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So I let them, do their thing, let them work out their problems, try stuff, be creative. Because then coaches want them to be creative on the field.
Yeah.
But you put constraints on them that aren't going to allow them. Parents put constraints on them. Hey, man, you're not doing this. I mean, I drive by where I live. There's a school, and on the weekends they play flag football, but it's organized by this company. And you see parents out there with their dry erase boards, and they're doing plays for the kids. And I'm like, okay, well, you're not developing anything. You're putting so much constraint. You're controlling everything.
Yes.
And so I don't know. So the only way it's going to change is to take those off and let the kids do it on their own. And so then as a coach, like, you have to pull back your ego to let them do it. So to me, man, at times I don't feel like a coach. I feel like a parent that's letting them go out to play, that's bringing them in, that's kind of giving them some instructions, like when we're in the weight room. But even then, like an example on last Friday, like I had some 7th graders leading like lifting stuff, like teaching their peers how to do certain lifts. Because the coaches want leaders too, right? Well, they're not going to learn how to lead without leading. So giving them these experiences that they normally wouldn't have, because the coaches always want to control everything. Then that takes time to do it. But then when you hear the feedback from the parents, they're like, man, my kid loves coming to train there. The only reason my kid is going to school is because he can't wait to train. Like, okay, man, then we have the buy-in. That's brilliant.
I love that. To me, that is, I mean, and I had a similar experience once I started implementing that in with men's tennis was the main group that I did that with at Cal. And I think largely because that was the one that the coaches were most bought into that idea. And I think there was less tennis players just love to play. I mean, not that all athletes don't, but like compared to like, let's say swimming or distance running or something, like tennis players, they love to play. And so that was just such a natural fit. And like, yeah, same thing. We'd roll out the ball. Hey, we're going to play volleyball for a warm up. All right, let's go. And I had so much joy either watching or even sometimes I would play with them. And there was so much joy in that. And you feel like you're saying, like when you were growing up and you were just going out and playing, you're sharing this experience where you're feeling the same way. And yeah, there's so much power there.
There's a great paper that came out by Mark O'Sullivan, and I think he's teaching in Norway, or he's a researcher in Norway. But he did him and 3 of his colleagues did a paper on Pavel Datsyuk, the great hockey player. And, economically, where Pavel grew up in Russia, like, you didn't get many sticks. Okay, so if you broke it, the hockey stick, you may not get one for a while. And they only had like 1 or 2 pucks, and so when you were playing and, skates were, used and hard to come by. And so in this paper, Pavel talks about like his favorite thing was to wear felt boots on the ice playing hockey. And he kind of talks about how it taught him to, move at different speeds and
Mm.
anticipate the opponent differently. And it's just a brilliant paper. I've read it 2 or 3 times now. And so these economic constraints made him the player he was, changed the game through his era, and he made the best of his situation. So there's so many different things to performance that we may not even think about that drive it. And so that's why I think when people say, well, I run a 4.540 or, I got to get strong to do this. It's like, well, I think that's such a narrow look at things. And when you start looking at some of these other populations, whether it's dance, whether it's alpine skiing, special operations, like human performance is so much more than that.
Yeah, that's something that Dan John talks about a lot is like the art, or basically the benefit of less, where if the best things that happen are sometimes when things are taken away from you and you have to find a way to make do. And that's where so much of our creativity, our ingenuity, and kind of what makes us human, almost like that archetype, like Rocky, like that Rocky archetype, like Zach Evanesh is always, I would love to do a podcast or something with Zach talking about his favorite like 80s movies, training movies. It's just because there's so much there, and it's so easy today to just have more. Oh, I saw these drills on Instagram. I have these new pieces of training equipment, and yeah, that's not to knock on any of that stuff. It's all great in its place, but I think the problem is more so it's more the greater context of how we look at it. We always look at it, well, what more can I put in? And it's like, no, at some point you need to take things away and just make do and be creative. And then you can come back to more later and whatever, you have. At least that's the way I think about it a lot. And certainly these people who have these, I like that. Yeah. Economic constraints, like where they had to make do, but it was their superpower. Like that's so cool. And it's it's an underdog story too, which makes it even more cool.
Well, the thing about him was because through the paper, you realize that he was special. Like, okay, so he had talent, but he like when they would select teams, he would make sure that he was on the team that had the less talent. So then he had to play at a different level in order to win. With the kids that we'll do some games with, like I'll have them play football with their offhand. So, most of them, they're always left-handed, or, don't catch things with these stupid receiver gloves,
Yeah.
Like make it harder for you, keep making it harder and harder and harder. So you get used to these difficult situations, because when it does get difficult and you haven't been exposed to anything but nice surroundings and all these, cool gyms and whatever, it's like, hey man, how are you going to respond to that?
Yeah.
So
it makes me even think about, or everything we were talking about makes me think about, I was just at a friend's house the other day. My wife and I went to a friend's house, and all our kids are basically in a similar age group. My kids are 4 and 6, and theirs are 5 and 7, or their younger ones are 5 and 7. And we were in their backyard. We were just playing, me and the other dad were playing soccer with the kids. And it was just funny because there's like a huge hill, and there's like all these puddles all over the place. My 4-year-old son just like eats it like right away in the puddle. But I was just thinking about what a beautiful constraint. You have to run around the puddles. You can go up the hill. Like, the kids are all playing together, talking about how they're going to play against us. It's like I'm coaching them. It's just like, I really treasure those constraints, or anything that's just like bare bones. It's not perfect. There's some weird stuff on the field. And that's to me, that's so much about what it's all about. But it's like, yeah, nowadays it's like, sign up for maybe your club team and you get everything right away. And it's all like pristine. You're, like you said, too, with like all the overcoaching that happens so quickly, too. People are just coached up right away. Like, and there's not space to, be creative and kind of just do typical human things. I would feel like more maybe is also a term for it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a cross-country skier. He's the best in the world, Johannes Klæbo from Norway. And he was on the smallish side when he was growing up. And I think his skiing was okay. And he's actually coached by his grandfather, who I think is 80 or 85 now. But they just worked on his technique. And he developed, I think they call it the Klæbo running now. Like if you see him go up hills, and everyone now is trying to emulate it. But like he through this course of him being on the smallest side and his grandfather, so they worked on these different techniques. And then when he hit his growth spurt, so then all this technical training, once they kind of formed, I mean, he is unbelievable in this technique. Like he just blows his opponents away. And so that's, another thing of people get so caught up in, oh yeah, man, I'm the best 12-year-old. I'm the best 10-year-old. And where it's like, you need to be cognizant of all of these other factors that go into it and not biased, which is hard to do. I totally understand that. But just because somebody is smallish at 10, 11, 12, you need to give them just as much attention because, hey, you never know at the end of that road what's going to happen. And now, like you watch this, I think last year at the beginning of the year he won like 90% of the races. So there's so much to be learned from other sports outside of just like the basics. That's why I love coaching, just because I learned so much.
Yeah, it's back to what we were talking about earlier too. Just the more exposure you get to studying sports and studying talent and studying the development of talent in those sports, I think if we don't just take time to look at that, we can really get buried in minutia. And again, I do want to get to some of the details of how you use technology, microwave and things like that. I'm excited to talk about that as well here. But I like that base of it's just being so important just to look at some of those global pieces as well in long-term development. And it always, sometimes it does frustrate me. I find it interesting, like a lot of the shows I've done on this podcast, the ones that are more about long-term development, more about motor learning, for some reason, those are not the most popular ones. Not even close. In fact, I would say they're actually typically the less popular. But to me, I'm like, there is so much gold in all of these. And maybe part of it is the feeling of, well, how do I apply this? And well, like you just said, like that, you apply it by allowing that time for athletes to be kids, to play games, to have not many constraints, to be creative. And I just think that there's so many ways that we can apply these things. I even think too about, you had talked about these economic constraints. It would be kind of cool if someone came up with, I don't know, it might not be cool if you put it on paper, it would lose its magic, but it's like, here's things to take away from athletes in your next practice, their next season, or I don't know, just here's something to do, here's something not to do or not to have, and or like lists of I don't know if they'd be constraints or whatnot, but it'd be interesting to talk more about, well, if you took away this, now what do they have to do? If you took away this, now what do they have to do? I just think that, there is a lot there, and the more stories you hear of that, I just think that makes it even better. But as soon as you make a machine out of it, a system out of it, then it's not quite as cool. It's not that you don't have quite the story behind each athlete who does have that happen.
Right. And I think learning from a lot of different sports, even a lot of different, the way people coach, communicate. There's a lot of different ways to change things up to give people, joy in their training, like even at the professional level. Like there's a great paper, or actually, so Niels van der Poel, who was the 5 and 10K speed skating Olympic champion and broke 2 world records, he kind of revolutionized the way speed skating is, I think, going to be trained coming up. But he went on a 5-2 model where he trained hard for 5 days and then rest for 2. He was doing 30 hours a week on his bike, during some of those weeks. And so you read his paper, you listen to him talk. There's a great podcast with Steven Seiler and his coach. And so you kind of listen to him like he wanted to have a normal life. And that was the main basis why he did, a 5-2. So I started doing that with some of my spec ops guys because, man, they're so focused. And, lo and behold, just that little change, they're like, oh my God, man, I'm doing things that I never did before. And, my training is, a lot funner during the week. And, I have hobbies that I kind of gave up. And, and those jobs are so stressful that you need some, not just exercise, but you need some other ways to kind of unwind. And so I think learning about how to take some of this stuff and put it into these situations that are going to benefit the athlete that are beyond just sets and reps and more work. Because at the end of the day, we're all kind of human beings that have our own, needs.
Mark, something that kind of goes with this, or at least the basic being a human, type thing. You had posted something about the benefits, or maybe reposted about the benefits of multi-age, like education or training. Basically, when you get kids of different ages together and they're playing together. And I was actually getting a Feldenkrais session from somebody who was really into like non-compulsory education, alternative educational models, and she was talking to me about how important and useful it is to have like an elementary education, like instead of everyone being all in the same age, all in the same class, like having kids of different ages. There's a lot of benefits of that because the older kids can teach the younger kids, or they feel like they're more of a leader or something like that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are for that, and like play and games and kind of like maybe what we've been talking about. Things are always so. All right, you're age 8, you're in this group, we're going to coach you, like thoughts on multi-age. Is that something you can do with the groups you're in as well? I'm not sure if you're, how you're getting your kids, but I'm curious if you're doing anything there.
Yes. And that's a great question. And this kind of goes to that we're trying to develop there. And, it's joy for sport for all. And that's taken directly from, the Norwegian sport model. And I think that's kind of their main thing that they want to do for everybody. And so then I've taken that concept, and joy for sport for all means that we need to work together as all, and we need to play together. And so, but, I started this back when I had my own training facility where the pro guys trained with the young guys. I mean, I had Super Bowl champion training with 11-year-old Pee Wee baseball player. And it's just the way that we did it. It was just normal. And I have taken that now with what we're doing at the school, and it's even more integrated, natural, where they can learn from each other. And I think that the older kids can benefit because, okay, I'm a role model now to these young kids. They can kind of show how we enjoy it. We work hard, but then we also play, and we're nice to each other. And being, a great human being is also at the top of our pyramid. And you don't get that by being a jerk to everybody and having girls and boys and whomever within these training sessions. I have a girls basketball player who she's my gymnastics coach. So she teaches the football guys. She teaches the baseball. She is the coach.
That's awesome.
So they have to respect her. So she's gaining self-confidence. She's taking her mastery of gymnastics and lending it to the group to make us better. I have a girl who's a filmmaker, visual art. She does all of our video and pictures now. So she's part of the group, and it's all in-house. And it's me giving her the opportunity to explore her passion, to then videotape our guys and gals within these trainings. So it's all this all-inclusive group that's working together to build this program to be the best in the world. And that's what I tell them. Now, again, nobody's going to give us an award. That's not what we're shooting for, but that's what we want to be. And so that's how I do it. And I think it benefits the whole community as a whole.
Yeah, I love that. I had something else on my question list too. I think it goes along with that, and then the Norwegian system, which I, up until this conversation, actually was not familiar with at all. But it was Erling. I'm gonna butcher his name. Erling Haaland's youth coach. Yeah. It was like the theme was as many as possible for as long as possible, as good as possible, and you had like some stats on how that group that started together as a youth, like just so much success within that group. I'm curious if you knew any more about that, the Norwegian system or the dynamics of that specific soccer group.
Yeah, so that research paper is just, it's so good, and I can't remember the author, but I'll get it for you.
Yeah, send it to me. I'll put it in the show notes for this too.
Yeah. And so they talk about this like small little region and how they had this youth team, and I think they started with 40 players. I think 39 boys and one girl. And they had one practice a week. I think they started at 10 or 11. Okay, and so they had one practice a week that was for like an hour. So there wasn't this pressure. And I think within the Norwegian youth system, like they don't keep score until they're 12 or 13. And
Wow.
then I don't even know if you can travel. There's travel restrictions on where you can even travel to play. And then once they got to, I think, 14 or 15, the coach gave them the choice. You could train 2 times a week or 4 times a week. But then it's, for the not so serious recreational, I think they called it, and on the developmental group. But then they still allowed those two groups to play together a couple times a week. And then they had a indoor facility built that was always open for the kids to come and play soccer, football. No adults, no nothing. So they could come on their own fruition. And so, again, kind of going back to what I'm trying to do at the school was giving these kids this opportunity to play, on their own and develop their skill within their peer group. And then, to make a long story short, at the end of it, I think 4 dropped out over the course of 8 to 10 years. So, started with 40, 36, ended up 6 of those athletes signed pro contracts. And now you have Erling Haaland, who's arguably, the greatest footballer around. And again, I think his dad played professionally, and there were some other things, within that system that allowed them to grow. But it's a phenomenal study. And again, just goes to show you that a lot can be done with letting kids do it on their own.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I love that. And even just going back to what you've done with like that, I guess just a good word for it too is community. Like, what's your talent within this group? You teach the group. Like when I was just a little bit up north of you over in Washington State, I was at Rafe Kelly's Return to the Source retreat, and just a huge part of that, you could just call it like a movement retreat of sorts, but a lot of it was just based around community. And I don't think we consider community dynamics nearly as much as it should be considered with those types of things. And yeah,
and that's part of. So I have a presentation that I give to parents and coaches and athletes, and a big part of that is because we want to build, and I think it goes back to as many as possible for as long as possible and as good as possible. And the only way that happens is if that as a community, and it's not just like what are they bought into. And I think the reason that worked there is they were in it for the long haul, and they're in it for the kids. And that's why I give the athletes a huge voice, because this is about them. And so, how can we build something that when the 4th or 5th grader comes in, that they want to be a part of until they're out of high school? And then and again, I've only been doing this for 3 years, but as they go through their adult life and they have kids, are those, do they want their kids to then come back within that system that we developed? So I should develop a system that when I die is still intact to sustain itself because we did it for the athlete. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about, the parent. It was about what we were developing as a community. So it was organically always going. So that's why I'm so passionate about giving the kids such a big voice in this, because it's for them.
Yeah, I love that. Let's switch gears just slightly in the sense of I know I read an article, I believe it was yours a while ago, talking about, and I think this has been a common theme of a lot of podcasts I've done, but basically delaying the inclusion of really intensive training methods. Like it's probably really easy to say, all right, well, you're 14 or 15 years old, let's throw some depth jumps in your program so you can jump higher, right? And you were talking about delaying that training stimulus as long as you could. Basically, if athletes were still making progress, well, we're good. We don't need to do this yet. I'm just curious for you to expand a little bit on when do you include like key training stimuli as an athlete grows and matures? Like what are some landmarks that you look at in terms of, okay, now be it like heavier lifting, plyometrics that are more intensive versus just playing the sport explosively, things like that. Curious what you look at for that aspect of development.
Yeah. So, and man, it's changed, quite a bit over the years. But when looking at the development, number one, I look at what's their training age. You may have a talented basketball player, but like he's never set foot in the weight room. He could be a junior or senior. So do we need to regress him to the point of a 12-year-old on the developmental side? But then you look at the sport of basketball, say itself, and well, okay, they're probably already doing a lot of depth jumps just naturally from jumping and just the game and the practice and all that itself. So are they already getting that exposure? And okay, is it okay to even start them off almost immediately with that type of training? And so there's a couple things I look at when I'm intensifying training. One is their ability to adapt to it through heart rate variability. So, how do they look after just even extensive training sessions? Like, is that blowing them up? If you have a 16, 17-year-old high school kid that's a high performer in the classroom, let's take. So he's got that stress. Nutrition, how is that? Is he getting 2 meals a day that consists of, 10 donuts and a burrito? Is he 5 hours of sleep? So, people say they're great athletes, maybe on the field, but that doesn't mean that with the work that I want to give them, they're even ready to do. So there has to be some physiological markers that we set that they have to check off to be able to even do this intensifying training. What's their resting heart rate? Well, if they have a resting heart rate of 75 to 80, we need to get that down through some extensive modes. We need to build their fitness so they can withstand what we want to give them later on. Number two is, strength levels. I don't really go on, do they have to squat 2 times their body weight to do depth jumps? You can do a good depth jump, and this probably better. You can do one from a 12-inch box, right? So you're not going to need a whole hell of a lot of strength to do that. So, what is their force velocity profile that we're looking at as well? Where do they stand there? And then actually, what do they need? Are depth jumps even a requirement for them now? I think also coaches at the high school level, it's kind of crazy. Like all this velocity-based training, it's all output driven, which I get to a certain point. But your team sport, man, you need some biological development of your hormonal system, of your cardiac system, of the mitochondria, both the slow and the fast twitch fibers. How can you handle stress, which is a totally different training modality? So I can get guys powerful and fast. That's not an issue. How do I build their reserves to withstand a 3-hour practice or a 2-hour game and then recover and come back a week later?
Yeah, it fits kind of with it's easy to do more, right? You already got athletes already being explosive. Well, it's easy to do more. Well, let's just do more explosive stuff. You could infinitely add explosive things into the mix, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the best thing for them. I did want to actually dig more into the aerobic and the resting heart rate, because that's something I actually, through all these podcasts, 350 some of them or whatever, I haven't gotten really far into that aerobic and capacity oriented base. And I think the pendulums always swing, right? And I think there has been, and maybe there still is that, don't do too much cardio. It's going to kill your, explosive gains. And yeah, sure. If you go train like a half marathon or a 5K, yeah, it's not going to be that great for you, but that doesn't mean there's a lot of other ways that you can do it that can really genuinely make a difference. And I even think about, in my own training history, as well as what I've observed through coaching track, and something like basketball, I've found to be a profoundly good base for something like high jump. And I think a huge part of it is all the explosive cuts and jumps and every explosive movement within the game itself. But I also look at, just like we were talking about with the music, when you play basketball, it desensitizes you to how hard you're actually working. And I could go out and run, 6 200s for track or 8 200s. And if you run with buddies, that makes it a little bit better in terms of the capacity. But I think I always underestimated actually how much capacity from like that hormonal or mitochondrial perspective playing basketball was for me. And then for the athletes as well that I observed who would play and do high jump or whatever, people who came off a basketball season, or even athletes who are playing intramural basketball during indoor track who weren't supposed to be. But I always noticed those kids actually did really darn good, all things considered. So I didn't really yell at them for it. But yeah, I'd like to get more into your take on that. So you said that there's obviously that heart rate 75 to 80. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the extensive methods that you'll put, and just really trying to make sure that they can recover? I'd love to get more into that.
So I think first off, what's the profile? So, of a basketball player, for example, what do these guys look like from a physiological standpoint? Typically resting heart rates can be anywhere from 40 to 55. Okay, so let's just go with that. So that's a baseline. And so you come in and I test you and you're 70, for example. And that's what it does bother me. People say, well, you don't need aerobic training for basketball or football. It's like, okay, you don't understand that A, you do, but B, the why. The why is based on the principle of cardiac development and the autonomic nervous system. For me, that's one of the principles that I was taught by Val. So cardio or aerobic is for the autonomic nervous system, first and foremost. So if you have a poor functioning, if you're always sympathetic driven at rest, okay, you're not going to perform well. You're not going to always recover well. So I look at it more of, okay, we're going to build that aerobic or cardiac system to improve your autonomic function so you can recover better from harder work. That's what bugs me when people say, well, we get it through the sport itself. We get the conditioning through the sport itself. There may be some of that, but the sustained effort over a 2-hour practice where you're standing, say, 60, 70% of the time, let's say American football, you're not getting the adaptation for that system. You're just not going to get it. So number one, you have to have a profile. You have to know what the norm is. You have to be able to test it. And then you have to have a field test to test it. So with the basketball players, there's a 30-15 submaximal test that Martin Bouchet, I think, he's the one that developed it, that we use. There's other sport-specific tests that you can use to determine the actual fitness for that sport. And then you back it, then you just backfill the training to get them to where the norm should be for that sport. And aerobic training you can be on a bike, it can be in a swimming pool. Randy talked about, Huntington talked about all the stuff that he does in the pool with his, sprint athletes. You can do general strength circuits. I mean, put a heart rate monitor on some of these kids or a Moxie monitor and see how a pillar or a pedestal drives, that cardiac system. In fact, some of it may be too hard. So, you could do tempo runs. You can do, for some guys, walking on a treadmill, gymnastics. That's why I like the long extended warmups with our kids, because it's going to give them that aerobic stimulus because they're constantly moving.
Yeah.
And it's play that you and I would have gotten as youngsters that, we get now maybe probably 4 to 5 hours a week of that type of work through non-program work. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get it. And then you have to test the athlete to see if it's improving. So to say they're fit, okay, how are you judging that?
Yeah, I love the idea of getting that through general means in the warm up. I think, yeah, in fact, like I said, like just if we think about cardio, maybe it's just a cultural thing. You think about cardio, you think of running on the treadmill or something. Yeah, of course, that's probably not the ideal way to get cardio. It's a way, but if you could do it doing a lot of dynamic general means that are differing and more like circuit training and strengthening different parts of the body, like that seems like a great way to get that piece of it. I know when I would have tennis, if we played basketball as a warm up for lifting, those guys, I think I didn't have heart rate monitors on them, but I bet you if we did, they would have had higher heart rates and work outputs than a lot of their actual tennis playing, or even some of the sprint conditioning that we did. It would have been, it's really substantial.
Yeah. And then like when you look at power sports and, there's people say there's not an aerobic component to it, which, I get that. But within the training, there might be. And so why not figure out ways to do zone 0 or zone 1 easy training to build that durability? Because I see it with track athletes in high school. They have these injuries that we never see in our group, and we train like super hard at times, but we don't have hamstring tendonitis. Some of these weird things, it's like, okay, why, if you're running 100 meters, why does said athlete have hamstring tendonitis? Why are they injured like that? Why the common occurrence for all these shin splints, So I constantly think of that. I look at that. I look at their work rate, what they're doing, and I try to think, okay, how can we stay out of that? And, Landon Evans, who is a big mentor of mine, and he talks about zone 0 a lot. Him and I'll have these conversations and, just doing these little things throughout the course of a workout. And if you do them day after day after day, year after year after year, then when these athletes get older, 17, 18, man, they have this huge base of very easy general training where now they can withstand some of these higher workloads with good coaching. That's the other thing I think people forget about. These injuries happen, because they're undertrained. I would also say that poor coaching delivers a lot of it as well.
What is the zone 0? Can you go more into that?
It'd be like walking. It'd be like doing, all these different ankle hops, walking around. I mean, because like when we're young and playing, you sprint, you tag your friend and then you go hide in the bushes and, you're just waiting there, you're talking, you're being quiet, and there are these built-in natural rest periods. I think where athletes get in issues with injuries is now coaches begin applying these rest periods that are sometimes just so detrimental to their overall growth of the athlete. And then they get hurt.
What about the rest period specifically? Sorry if I'm not following that well enough. I too short, or for what type of workout? Too short, too long?
Some of them are short, and then the density of that work just becomes so overwhelming to their system that they break, and they never go back to say, why did they break? Randy, I don't know if I think it was on your podcast where he talks about building that weekly density. And he would do it in the swimming pool with his guys.
Yeah.
Because it's unloading them, but they're getting the work in. So that's why we have a lot of our football players ride the bike. Because you have 250, 60-pound, 200-pound guys doing, a lot of tempo work. It's going to break them down, I've found. So I need to figure out ways to take the load off them, but still build that density of work, where then I can begin to see the changes on, the adaptations that I'm looking for through HRV and, all the other testing that we're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of it too. And I will say, I love the assault bike. I've definitely warmed up to that more and more, having people like Kyle Wall, Angus Bradley on the show talking about it. And it is like, I think about too a lot with the cardio thing. It's not so much, we talk about, cardio will kill your gains or something, or strength or speed. And it's like, yeah, if you do your sport that should be speed as cardio, then yeah, But if you just do cardio and it's like in the pool or it's unloaded on the assault bike or it's dynamic, it's a totally different story. And ever since those podcasts with Randy, a lot of my online clients, if they have a pool and they're in an output sport like track and field, they're definitely doing tempo in the pool. Like, and I remember doing that back when I was at Wilmington College. They had a pool, and I thought about the things that, it's funny because that college didn't have a lot. Like, talking about having less, they had a lot less in terms of indoor facilities, but they had a pool, and like just making use of that was a really big thing for and if going back, I don't think I valued it as much as I do now, the fact that we had that. And so, that's a great place for that cardio conditioning. And I just like swimming more now. Like, I'll actually swim for my tempo now because I had the opportunity to learn for me personally, if I get a chance, I was able to learn swimming strokes from some of the volunteer assistants back when I was at Cal. And so I actually like trying to figure out how to swim too. And I was like, well, this is a good cardio, and it's better doing it here than than pounding the track if I want to be fast. So that was always a great experience.
Right. Absolutely.
Mark, real quick before we close this out. So, you had mentioned the resting heart rate of 75 to 80. Like, so that indicate, I'm just curious, like getting into a little bit of the details of this. And I think maybe this might be a little bit too, we might not have time to get really thoroughly into the omega wave portion and all those. Maybe we can save that for another time. But I would love to get a little bit into, so basically if an athlete is, if people just have heart rate and that's all they have to work off of. Yeah. I mean, is there a dividing line where resting heart rate, you're pretty like definitively in more of a resting sympathetic state, or is that something you need an omega wave to really fully hash out?
Yeah, I think that's something you need some type of HRV tool to look deeper into, because, for example, you could have a low resting heart rate, but then it could be caused by overtraining. Like, you could be so parasympathetic overreaching. So, while there's markers that I look for within certain sports, then to dig deeper, it's like, okay, your norm is, say, 45 to 55. So that's where you normally are. But then if you're way lower than that or way higher than that, what's causing it? Are you coming down with an illness? Are you overtrained? Did you have poor sleep last night? Like, if you have a family, did the baby wait? Like, there's a lot of other context that goes into, why it's there. But if you're looking at this data all the time, if you have baselines, then you can say, okay, if you're over and above that for an extended period of time, let's look deeper into it. That's why HRV is great. Like, okay, you're out of these norms now. Why? So then it allows me to ask deeper and better questions to the athlete to learn more of, oh yeah, man, I have this AP economics test, this week, and man, I'm super stressed. And okay, so that's it. And if you're more sympathetic overreaching, then we're going to change the recovery modalities. If you're more parasympathetic, we're going to change the way that we train you. So then it just allows more individualization for, the training structure. Because if you're sympathetic overreaching, like, you're not going to go out and do a ton of sprints, at full gas. You want to get back to that homeostasis of, okay, let's do some easy training and let's, try to modify your nutrition maybe to see if that helps. And whereas parasympathetic, yeah, man, maybe we're going to do some high intensive stuff, but it's going to be extremely low volume to kind of kickstart the sympathetic nervous system. So it's all this, this yin and this yang throughout. It's kind of life, it kind of ebbs and flows.
Yeah. So maybe I'm getting a little bit into the HRV. I'm trying to figure out exactly where I want to go with this, staying in the scope a little bit more of developmental chat. But let me ask you this, and I'm sure we don't have time to go through every single sport with the protocol in the sense of what their general cardio ability or aerobic ability should be. But I am curious your take on, let's just say for more the speed power end of the spectrum, let's say football or even track, like a sprinter, but maybe like a football type person where it's mostly power based, more than like, let's say soccer, like a continual field sport. What's the aerobic threshold for something like that? Like, where should they generally be so they have enough to be adequately recovering from the speed and power work they're doing?
Yeah, so like right now, I would say on average, the high school guys that are testing the football players, like their average heart rate is probably like 52. And I have one kid that's like 45.
Hmm.
And, in the preseason, like our tempo work, and I'm including bike on this, we would hit anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 yards of volume because they need to be able to recover from these repeated bouts, not only in the game, but practice. That's why GPS can inform you of how much yardage they're covering of different running velocities and why they need big aerobic base. So, if they can hit 5 to 7,000 yards a week consistently, have a resting heart rate of anywhere, say 45 to, 60, because some of the linemen are just bigger guys, so they're going to have, maybe a higher resting heart rate. And there's different work that we do in the weight room to even facilitate the aerobic system even more through, oxidative work of the slow fibers. So not only are we doing it through running, but then we're also doing it through weightlifting. So tempo squats of 4 seconds total each rep, which is based off the work of Viktor Selyanov. So then, and then also the fast fiber oxidative, with hill sprints. So less than 5 seconds with a 60-second recovery in the off season. As it gets closer to the season, we'll drop that to 30 seconds because that's kind of, a no huddle offense, kind of what they work on. And we have guys doing 50 reps of that in a session, and their heart rates don't get over, 150. So it's non-specific, specific work. And then the work at the end of the season, at the end of preseason, moves into pads, game specific work for conditioning. So, you have to have a good aerobic system, not only for the game, but to recover from it in between plays. And then when you go home at night and sleep, you have to recover. You have to be able to sleep well.
Yeah, I think it is funny. Like as soon as you say, I must call it like the S word, slow twitch. Like, because I know that it is kind of funny. I think we hear that. I remember even when I was very first learning about training, when I was like 15, reading this book called The Science of Jumping, and talks about fast and slow twitch muscles. And it's like, oh, can't do any slow twitch. And I think that we're almost sometimes so afraid of it, we don't realize that you can do that kind of it's like yin and yang. You do some yin, you do some yang, but ultimately you're getting the highest exposure of the yang stuff if you're football or track. Like that's your main exposure. But
and if football is a sport of, speed less than anaerobic threshold, you need both slow and fast. And if they have a higher, if they have a good aerobic base, they're not going to tap into those glycolytic tissues so fast. So then fatigue is delayed. And so, the more that you can, and, you can increase speed of, I think, 20% by working, the slow fibers, because you're going to have a better relaxation phase on the, for sprinting. So better relaxation is going to equal faster times. And, you're not going to tap into this stuff so soon. So we do it with both upper and lower body because linemen need that aerobic capacity of the upper body, which people don't think of. But with all the punching and everything, like you better have a high aerobic zone on your upper body. So kind of have to look at the demands and then train it.
Yeah, I'm sure this goes without saying, but and I don't know if there was like a period of time where you didn't do as much aerobic work or whatnot, or any way to compare, but is there any way of comparing like even looking at basic fast twitch outputs, like standing broad, standing triple, 30 meter, 40 yard dash, with or without the inclusion of the aerobic work? Do you have any sort of anecdotes that would maybe, help people there? I'm just curious, just from my own perspective.
No, and that's why we test. So, God, man, we've been doing aerobic work for a long time, so I can't say that doing it or not doing it is good or bad. What I can say is that we did triple jump, two-legged triple jump here a couple weeks ago, and one of our athletes, well, all of them, but one of them improved his standing triple from 28.11 to 30.5. And he was doing 3 times a week of this oxidative work, plus, 5,000 yards of tempo a week. And he's 215 pounds.
Wow.
And his resting heart rate is like, it was 46 this morning.
Nice.
So, so what I can say is that it's not hurting them. And then subjectively, what I can say when these guys sprint is they're like, oh my God, I feel so fast.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I the only thing I could think of from that perspective is like, because I'm trying to dig up anecdotes. I guess I think of when I was in college doing high jump and triple jump and javelin, and it was hurdles for a little bit, but my resting heart was pretty darn low. It's like 45, low 40s if I really let myself chill out. And obviously my recovery was way better back then, but I guess you could say the cardio I was getting was like in the summer I worked moving. So just like moving furniture, which is basically just like GPP. It's like carrying heavy stuff around up and down the stairs. But it's not, I think the key was just, it wasn't distance running for me, or even like when I was in track, like you would do like 8x200, 5x300, like stuff like that. And that was fine. Circuits, longer warm-ups, circuits, things like that. We did like circuits. My coach called them scramble circuits. Our team would run around the field or around the campus, and we'd jog like 200 meters, and then we'd go do push-ups. And whoever, back to autonomy, the coach would ask, hey, so-and-so, how many push-ups are we going to do? So-and-so would be like 20, and we'd all do 20, and we just do that for like 30 or 40 minutes. And so it's not like, but in other times in my life when I remember one time, I just was taking kind of a break from training, age, 24. I was like, I'll just do some running for a little while. I wasn't putting in a lot of running. I don't know, maybe like 15, 20 miles a week. But I remember, and I wasn't doing anything else though. No strength, nothing else. I went to jump after like, month and a half, 2 months of doing that. And like literally I lost 8 inches on my jump. It was a train wreck. Like it was, for me, that got destroyed by that. So it just kind of makes me think of like the balance, like how do you get this aerobic work? And it is important to recover. And I feel it too. If I'm not aerobically good, my recovery from my sprint sessions, from my heavier lift or power lift type sessions is substantially worse, especially the sprint stuff. I feel like gets so much worse if my aerobic system is suffering. So it's just always thinking of creative, good ways to kind of keep that rolling pretty well.
Well, I look at cross-country skiers, and like there's a sport, it's called distance skiing, where these guys will ski, 50 to 90K. And, there's pros that do it. And so, but you look at their strength training and it's heavy, like triples and doubles, and they're strong, their relative strength is through the roof. So they're not doing a bunch of high rep stuff. They're doing low reps, that's going to get them strong, but they still keep up their endurance. And then you watch them, some of them post their like hurdle jumping. It's like, oh my God, man, you're explosive too. So put everything in context. It's like if these extreme endurance guys are doing this and are still good on the endurance side, why can't power speed athletes be good at that and then have a good aerobic side? So it's just I think it just overall just makes them, some of these special ops guys that I have training, like the one guy is like he ran a 5:55 mile. He weighs 230 pounds. He can deadlift like 450, resting heart rate of like 35 or something like that. So to think that you're going to all of a sudden lose your strength or speed or power through doing this stuff is just not true.
Yeah. Well, hey, I think that's a good place to drop off there. I know we didn't get super into the nuts and bolts of weekly training sessions, but maybe it'll make for a good podcast down the road. I really enjoyed the things we covered today, Mark, and it was great having you on. Is there any, if you have any closing thoughts or where people can reach you at, if you have any resources for folks, if you want to let anybody know before we click the record button here?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. God, I don't remember what my Twitter name is. Instagram, Mark PTC. Hold on. What's my Twitter? Oh, results_period on Twitter. Yeah, closing thoughts. if you're working with young athletes, I think just, kind of expanding your, knowledge with some of these people like Athletic Skills Model and kind of looking what the Norwegians and, even like the Swedes have done with, athletic development and, just trying to expand your learning. And then, listen to a lot of the podcasts that you have on. Randy and some of these other great guests that you've had on. I mean, there's just so much information out there that is so good that if you just keep kind of digging at it, it'll pop up and then you can apply it with your athletes.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much again for being on, Mark. It was really great having you.
Thanks again, Joel. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. It was great having you here, and we'll see you next week.